Hello, guys. Today, let us talk about authentic versus created materials. This is under our subject, um, language learning materials development. So, when can we say that a material that we're going to use in our teaching is authentic, and when do we say that it's inauthentic or created? When we say authentic materials, this refer to the use in teaching of texts like photographs, video selections, and other teaching resources that were not specifically prepared for pedagogic purposes. So when we say authentic materials, these are those materials which were not really made for pedagogic purposes. When you say pedagogic purposes, not really made for teaching purposes, not really prepared by teachers, but they were from different sources, like for example TV newscasts, like for example magazine articles, news articles, and the likes. Authentic materials are also known as real life or genuine materials. To continue, according to Klikaya, characterizes authentic materials as materials which expose the real world and how it is used in the target language. So it tries to expose the real world with the use of the target language. Like for example, when you're teaching English, then you would be getting materials. When you say authentic, when you would want to make use of authentic materials, you would make use of materials like newscasts, which make use of English as the medium. On the other side, Little, Devitt, and Singleton, as cited in Peacock in 1997, state that uh, identify real life materials as materials which are created and used for a social purpose. So there's this social purpose. How was it used? Was it used to communicate something, to deliver information or whatsoever in the language community of the native speakers? So how do the native speakers make use of that particular language that you're teaching, specifically English? So, Rogers and Medley characterize authentic as materials which expose the genuineness and naturalness of the language and well contextualized in the native speaker's context. So, how do the native speakers make use of the language in their conversation? These materials can be in the form of oral and written form. So, again, it could be oral or it could be written. Moreover, Wong, Kwok, and Choi describe that authentic materials are identified by their authenticity in time, people, and location. Let's take note of that. It should be authentic in time, people, and location. These materials exist in the target language country. It was from a target language country, used by the people of that country, and exist in the current situation. So we also have to take note that it should be current. It should be something which is up to date. Let us continue. Gerbard, as cited in Aura, informs that authentic materials vary into several types. They can be in the form of listening materials, such as radio show and songs. So those are materials which you can get, radio shows and songs. Visual materials like the TV show and movies. It could be talk shows, clips from online clips, printed materials such as a magazine, poster, and map, and realia or real world objects like dolls. So those are all examples of authentic materials. Many authors have examined the use of authentic materials in the classroom practice. They agree that the use of the materials is very prominent for the students. Now, we will be moving on to created materials. So let us continue. How about created materials or inauthentic materials? So these refer to textbooks and other specially developed instructional resources. So these are the materials which were created intently for teaching, for pedagogic purposes. On the other side, non-authentic materials are teaching materials which are made and designed for teaching purposes only. So again, these were made and designed, constructed for teaching purposes. These materials are planned, designed, and produced based on the curriculum. So we have this curriculum which served as the basis in the creation of materials. We have this set of lessons, of objectives, of teaching objectives, of learning objectives, which served as the basis in the creation, in the design of materials and policy in each curriculum and policy in each country. Let us talk about advantages of authentic materials. Firstly, genuine materials enable learners to experience the real language. So students would have the idea of how a target language, how really English is being used in the real scenario, in the real world, and have a closer interaction with the target language. So somehow it could also serve as a motivation for students when they would know that they would have a glimpse, they would have a view of how really a certain language is being used in the real context. Klikaya states that the use of authentic materials gives learners genuine exposure of the target language. So we provide them with genuine exposure. They would know this how English is really being used in for example in communication, how really it is being used in journalism and other fields. By using authentic materials, learners can feel directly how the language they learn is employed in real situation. Moreover, it makes them feel closer to the target language. So you would be able, by using authentic materials, you would be able to create a link. You would be able to um, create somehow a relationship between the learners and the target language as they use the items which exist in the real world in their classroom. This is also in line with Al Azwi and Al Rashadi, who underpin that real life materials significantly lessen the gap. So, between the language taught in the classroom and the language used in the real life. So, you would be able to connect the classroom, the language in the classroom, to the language in the real life. Other scholars who support this are Wang et al., who argue that by experiencing the real language in the classroom, it will prepare them to better employ English outside the classroom. So, since you provided the students with how really English is being used outside, so when they went outside, because teaching is preparation for, we prepare the students for the real life outside the classroom. So with when you as teachers, when we as teachers would be able to provide them with a glimpse of how really English is being used in the real context, then we would be able to prepare them. We would be able to make them ready when they are already faced with situations wherein they need to make use of English in the real context, in the real world. Advantages claimed for authentic materials are, so these are the advantages. Number one, they have a positive effect on learner motivation because they are intrinsically more interesting and motivating than created materials. So, mind you, when we make use of authentic materials, we are also making use of materials which are motivating for the learners because, as mentioned here, they are more interesting and more motivating than created materials. There is a huge source of authentic materials for language learning in the media, on the web, and these relate closely to the interests of many language learners. So, definitely when you are to teach English and you want to make use of authentic materials, you would be choosing particular clips, particular video clips, particular articles which you think would really interest your learners. So that's another thing that you should consider. Think about or consider the interests of the language learners, and then get the materials which are relevant to their interests. They provide also authentic cultural information about the target culture. So you don't just we don't just teach language, but at the same time, we will be able to expose the students with the culture, with the target culture, what's really happening around them. Materials can be selected to illustrate many aspects of target culture, including culturally based practices, their practices, the practices of the people, how do they talk, and beliefs, how do they what are their beliefs in both linguistic and non-linguistic behavior. So we're hitting two birds with one stone when we do make use of authentic materials. And they provide exposure to real language rather than the artificial texts found in created materials that have been specially written to illustrate particular grammatical rules or discourse types. Real language rather than the artificial texts. So um not the artificial ones. They relate more closely to learners' needs and hence provide a link between the classroom and students' need in the real world, because as I mentioned, you consider who your learners are, what are their interests before getting a particular materials that you would want to make use inside your class. They support a more creative approach to teaching. Teachers can develop their full potentials as teachers, developing activities and tasks that better match their teaching styles and the learning styles of students. So at the same time, you would be getting materials which also interest you as teachers. So the skills of teachers, the potentials of teachers are also honed, are also improved by making use of authentic materials. Let's continue, guys, with the critics of the use of authentic materials. There are also some critics of the use of authentic materials. Number one, they say that created materials can also be motivating for learners. So definitely, teachers could also make inauthentic materials motivating for learners. Published materials are often designed to look like teenage magazines. So because there are illustrations and other kinds of real world materials, and maybe just as interesting and motivating for learners, because we know the learners we have so many learners who are visual. Authentic materials often contain difficult language and unneeded vocabulary items. So it's one thing that you should also consider. There are a lot of materials, yes. Many authentic materials contain difficult language, the vocabulary. Since they have not been simplified or written based on any lexical or linguistic guidelines, they often contain language that may be beyond the learner's abilities. Yes, that's true, because those were really made you really were really prepared for real life context, for real life situations, for social context. They contain they were not really prepared for students whose abilities were not considered when they were prepared. So to continue, created materials may be superior to authentic materials. Why? Because they are generally built around a graded syllabus and hence provide a systematic coverage of teaching items. Yes, created materials or inauthentic materials somehow are more systematic because they were based the progression, the presentation is based on the syllabus, the curriculum prepared. So that's another thing. Another one is using authentic materials is a burden for teachers. Why? In order to develop learning resources around authentic materials, teachers have to be prepared to spend a considerable amount of time locating suitable sources for materials and developing activities and exercises to accompany the materials. Yes, it would somehow be a burden for teachers, because teachers would uh, really need to exert effort in looking for materials. But nowadays, with the advent of technology, with the advent of the internet, it's easier to find materials. But then another task for teachers is for teachers to really study the materials before they present them, they make use of them in their classes. Advantages and disadvantages of non-authentic materials. What about the advantages and disadvantages of non-authentic materials? Non-authentic materials are considered more suitable and appropriate for the learners. As it has been discussed earlier, real life materials are too complex and difficult to be understood. On the other side, non-authentic materials such as textbooks are designed by the teacher based on the learner's capability and language level. Thus, it is easier for the learner to master the lesson. So we already mentioned that because textbooks were based on curriculum based on a certain syllabus. More so, it is believed that the use of language should suit the local context, since real life materials also contain some cultural difference between the target and the target language culture. So it is considered better for the teacher to use their own materials which are non-authentic. So that's another downside, because you would be making use um, old materials which are being used in other countries. Then there would be a problem with in terms of teaching the culture. So somehow when you try to localize, so make use of localized materials, you also make use of non-authentic materials. And that's it for today. Thank you, guys. Thank you for